Good morning. On behalf, on behalf of the director of the Bard Graduate Center, Susan Weber, it's my pleasure to welcome all of you here in this room and in the overflow room next door to today's symposium. I would also like to welcome those of you watching us elsewhere in the world on BGC TV. Bard Graduate Center respectfully acknowledges that while we are here on West 86th Street, we are at the same time in Lenapehoking, the ancestral homeland of the Lenni Lenape. And we also recognize New York City as a past, present, and future crossroads for many indigenous people. Today is the first Mr. and Mrs. Raymond Horowitz Book Prize Symposium, and so it is appropriate to begin with a word about the Horowitzes and their gift. The Mr. and Mrs. Raymond J. Horowitz Foundation for the Arts was established by Raymond and Margaret Horowitz in 1993. During their lives, they collected works by overlooked American Impressionists as well as American realist painters. They generously left their collection to the National Gallery, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Brooklyn Museum, and other important public institutions. In 2012, the Horowitz Foundation endowed an Institute for the Arts of the Americas at the Bard Graduate Center that supports student fellowships and faculty research. We are very grateful to the Foundation for this gift, and we are honored to be building on the legacy of Mr. and Mrs. Raymond J. Horowitz. The establishment of this book prize represents the belief of the Horowitz Foundation and the BGC that the best way to honor great scholarship is by generating more of it. And that is the treat we have in store for us today. The prize is awarded annually by a committee of BGC faculty to what they deem the best book in the decorative arts, design history, and material culture of the Americas. As the Bard Graduate Center celebrates its quarter century this year, we are proud to mark it by pushing the geographical boundaries of what elsewhere is generally called American studies. This small single-letter shift from American to Americas reflects the commitment of the BGC to a truly hemispherical approach and not the more common focus on one country only. Awarding the inaugural Horowitz Book Prize to Gary Urton's Inka History in Knots reading Khipus as primary sources, which was published by the University of Texas Press in 2017, reflects this commitment to geographical breadth. But it honors much more than this. Gary's book is a remarkable example of the cultural history of the material world. First and foremost, Inka History in Knots is about textile, about corded fiber, about the very matter of communication. It is a history written from and out of material. For the deep learning and the dexterity with which that learning is spun into story, Gary's book earned the admiration and awe of the book committee. For this alone, it would merit the Horowitz Prize. But there is a whole other argument that the book makes, and which puts it on a different plane altogether. And with this, I will draw my remarks to a close. Gary argues in this book, and it is a book that is as passionate as it is erudite, that for far too long, the presence or absence of an indigenous written history has been taken as an index of civilization. With it, and a non-European culture is accorded equality with Europe. Without it, and that culture is relegated to a kind of second division in the league table of nations. Cracking the code of the quipus has, for Gary, been about the objects, but also about the subjectivity that is or is not accorded to the people who made them and used them. Gary has responded to the challenge of written history by decoding the quipus as documentary writing. The preservation of lists, like the act of list making, in fact goes back to the beginning of states and administrative documentation. We find it in the earliest writing from Sumer in Mesopotamia, as we do in inscriptions all across the Greco-Roman Mediterranean, and in the monograph tradition of Chinese imperial history. And these lists, in turn, provided the first modern source-based researchers into the past, the antiquarians of early modern Europe, with their body of evidence. We have gotten used to thinking that history is narrative, when in fact most conserving of past memory has not been through narrative, but through what Francis Bacon once described as, and I quote, passages of books that concern not story. This slippage has occurred because histories and writing are what are studied by historians trained to work with writing. And so the other thing that so captivated the committee about this book is that it points us towards a future in which we can find the past in places other than writing, because we and our students will have learned how to read other languages, whether metal or wood or ceramic or, as in Gary's case, fiber, and to treat them as sources. By putting the issue of what counts as written front and center, Gary has made an argument that transcends Andean studies and is vital for all of those who seek the past in decorative arts, design history, and material culture. The symposium is really Gary's, and so this is where the baton is passed. Gary Urton is Dumbarton Oaks Professor of Pre-Columbian Studies in the Department of Anthropology at Harvard University. His MA and PhD degrees are in anthropology and were awarded by the University of Illinois Champaign-Urbana. He is the author of a number of books, including At the Crossroads of the Earth and the Sky, 1981, The History of a Myth, 1990, The Social Life of Numbers, 1997, Inka Myths, 1999, Signs of the Inka Khipu, 2003, and of course, Inka History in Knots. He has been awarded fellowships by the John Simon Guggenheim Foundation and the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation. He is the founder and director of the Harvard Khipu Database Project. And so it is my great pleasure now, on behalf of the Bard Graduate Center, to introduce Gary Urton to begin this symposium.
Thank you, Peter, for that wonderful introduction. I'm so grateful and so humbled by it. I appreciate it, and I appreciate very much everyone's presence here. This is a wonderful day for Andean and Khipu studies, and I'm just so pleased that we've been given this opportunity. We've been afforded this opportunity by the Bard Graduate Center and by the Horowitz Foundation. So I do want to begin just by thanking several people for making this possible. First of all, to the Mr. and Mrs. Raymond J. Horowitz Foundation for providing the funds that made this prize possible, and also to the Horowitz Book Prize Committee of the Bard Graduate Center for selecting Inka History and Knots, Reading Khipus as Primary Sources as the inaugural recipient of the Mr. and Mrs. Raymond J. Horowitz Prize. It is indeed a great honor. I thank Peter Miller as well, Dean of the Bard Graduate Center, for extraordinary collegiality and support and help over the several months or so that we've been talking about and planning this symposium. He's been wonderful to work with, and I'm extremely grateful to him. To Ms. Laura Minsky as well, who is the Associate Director of Research Programs at the Bard Graduate Center here. She's done an extraordinary job of making all of this possible, of getting some 8 people from Iowa City to Paris here at the same place at the same time, and it's quite an accomplishment, I think. And she's been wonderful to work with, and I thank her tremendously. To all the participants as well, to Jeffrey Splittstosser, John Clendaniel, Bruce Mannheim, Terry Daltroy, Sabine Highland, Jose Carlos de la Puente Luna, and Frank Solomon, I thank you very much for accepting the invitation to come here and make presentations on the topic of the Khipus and history. And I know that it is potentially a disruption in university teaching or research or whatever, so I very much appreciate your time and your contributions. And then finally, and most importantly for today, I thank you, the members of the audience, for your attendance and for your apparent interest in spending the better part of a day in the warmth, attending to a set of papers on an ancient artifact of the Americas, the quipu, that until recent times has received actually very little notice or attention, but which, as I believe will become evident as we proceed, is not only an object of real beauty, but is as well an object of great interest and importance one that gives us deep insights into the culture, the technology, intellectual traditions, and the history of the largest and arguably most complex state or empire of the ancient Americas, Tawantinsuyu, the Inka Empire. And I think I speak for all the participants in this symposium when I say we're deeply appreciative of your attendance and your attention and your comments toward the end of the symposium as we have the panel discussion. So thank you all for being here. And thanks again to the Bard Graduate Center. So I think with that, turns out I'm the first speaker. So, so I'll just take the very kind introduction of Peter and move into my talk. And if it's possible, maybe to lower the lights, especially just immediately over the screen here. So what I want to do is, this is the title, Finding Time for History in the Inka Khipus that I originally gave to the talk. What in the end I basically want to do here this morning is to give sort of a crash course to everyone in the history of the study of the Khipus, and then say something very briefly about my own argument that I make in the book, but mostly to try to, since I know that, I mean, there are some people here who know everything about the Khipus, and I assume there's some people here who know very little about the Khipus, so I think it's perhaps useful so that we all are on the same page, and so that you can appreciate the talks by the extraordinary set of speakers we have who are contributing presentations to this conference. For me, just to give you a little bit of background on the study of the Inka Khipus, and in the first place, just the simplest point to make here is that we are talking about Tawantinsuyu, the land of the four quarters. Tawantinsuyu was the name by which the Incas knew their empire. So it was an empire that stretched from the northern border of present-day Ecuador down to about the center of present-day Santiago de Chile. It was divided into four quarters, and so that's the Tawa, and then the quarters or the parts are the Suyu, so it's four parts intimately bound together. And the quipu then was the device that the Incas used for administering a state that pulled together and that attempted to integrate peoples and cultures, various ethnic groups, and people speaking many different languages into a single unified empire. So that's the great practical interest to us of the quipus, how the Incas were able to manage this feed of communication and the storage of information without a two-dimensional script writing similar to the kinds of logographic scripts that were devised in every other ancient state or empire, like cuneiform or hieroglyphs, etc. So what kinds of things are these? And here I just give you a brief potpourri of images of quipus. These are images primarily that are taken from the collection of the Ethnologische Museum in Berlin. This is the largest collection in existence. We have about 1,050 examples of quipus in the world in museums in Europe, North America, and South America. There are about 450 samples in the collection in Berlin. The quipus then are these spun and plied, primarily cotton, but also some camelid fiber arrangements of knotted cords. You will see as we flip through the images here that many of the cords have knots tied into them, and in many cases they have knots that are arranged on tiers at different levels. And the basic structure of the quipu is a primary cord that runs horizontally, from which then are suspended a variable number of what we call pendant cords. And on this extraordinarily complex sample here, which is a quipu that's recently come into the collection of the Dumbarton Oaks Library and Museum in Washington, D.C., we can see the basic structure of the quipu with the primary cord. This is not working, actually, this pointer, it seems. We can see the primary cord, the main horizontal cord here, from which fall what we term pendant strings. Many of these are bound together by strings leaving in the opposite direction. These we call top cords. And then you also see a great number of oblique cords, and those are all what we call subsidiary cords those are tied on to either the pendant cords or the top cords as secondary level cords. So quipus can get and do get extraordinarily complex in structural terms, in terms of the branching structures of chords at different levels. In terms of the knotting on the quipus, this basically, for the most part, has to do with the recording of data, of quantitative data. So we have in about 90% of the quipu chords, we have knots organized on tiers at different levels here. And these different levels of knots signify values in a base 10 system, so that each different level of knots is a higher order power of 10, with the ones beginning at the bottom, the tens, the hundreds, the thousands, etc. We have some quipus that record up to 100,000, but theoretically one could record into the millions for it can go as long as you have the quipu pendant chord. So as I say, about 90% of all chords on the 1,050 quipus that have been studied closely to date, and that's just about 600 or 700, because many of the quipus are too fragile to allow for their study. But they do have this kind of decimal arrangement of the knots. About 10% of the chords have a non-decimal arrangement. I call them anomalous in the sense that they don't follow the predominant decimal organizational rule, and these have also been considered to be possibly narrative quipus. In many of the Spanish chronicles, they tell us that the Incas relied on the quipus to record information that was used for the production of narratives, of life histories of the kings and queens of the Inka Empire, etc. And it's thought that these that don't have their knots organized in a decimal manner may be ones that were narrative quipus, and these remain very much a very complex and a challenging part of the study of quipus. What kind of information do we have about quipus? We have a lot of information that was recorded in the Spanish chronicles and by administrators of the early Spanish state. So following the conquest of the Andes of Tawantinsuyu in 1532, Spanish officials began coming in, and one of the things they noticed straight off was that there was this cadre of officials running around with their knotted cords, and they appeared to have great importance in the Inka Empire. Turned out these were some of what were several thousands. We don't know the number of this, but several thousands of people who were appointed and entrusted with the responsibility of keeping track of information pertaining to the Inca state that had to do with censuses, it had to do with the keeping of tribute data, the recording of material about goods stored in state storehouses, etc., etc. So we have a lot of accounts and descriptions of this kind of registration of information by the Quipu Kamayoks, some in the capital city of Cusco, others in administrative centers in the provinces, others at the local level. Today, all we have is the remaining quipus, and we have no sort of tag attached to any one of these quipus telling us this is a royal quipu, one from Cusco, or this is a local quipu, etc. So we have a big problem there, sort of sorting out what's what. We also have some representations, like you see here, imagery, drawings of quipu keepers working at their trade, primarily by the indigenous chronicler Wamapoma de Ayala, who worked at the end of the 16th and beginning of the 17th century. And then other images in color over here, which were included in a chronicle by Martin de Murua, but were images probably drawn by Wamapoma de Ayala himself as well. So we do have some images that indicate to us, yeah, that these things were carried around, they were manipulated, they were worked in this way or that way, and I'll talk in a moment a little bit more about the figure in the center. So we do have a lot about the quipus, a lot of information about the quipus that is recorded in the Spanish chronicles. Also, soon, a couple of decades after the conquest or so, the Spaniards began a systematic process of recovering data or transcribing data included in the quipus. And so they began various processes in different times and places of calling in quipu keepers, of having them read the contents of their quipus cord by cord. And a translator then would translate the narrative reading of the quipu by the quipu Kamayak into Spanish. And a scribe then would write down the Spanish translation of the reading of the quipu by the quipu keeper, establishing then this very fascinating mediated relationship between the quipu and the written document. We now have about some 70 or so, some 70-ish or so transcriptions of the readings of quipus in archives in Spain and in Peru primarily. These are line by line inscriptions of what was said to have been spoken cord by cord in the reading of quipus by the quipu keepers. These have been now anthologized in a pair of books by Marty Parsonen and Hukka Kiviharhu, who are Finnish, and they began with the publication of the first of this set of collected quipu transcriptions in 2004, and then subsequently a second volume in 2010. So this is a set of publications that has been little used really to the present day. It exists out there, but it's an enormous body of data. I have one student at Harvard, Manuel Medrano, who's in the process of analyzing, of actually computerizing all the data and analyzing all this material in the quipus. So what approaches and methods have been used in the modern scientific study of quipus? To talk about this, we go back to the beginning and the earliest modern era collections of quipu samples in the field. The German Adolf Bastian, for instance, in his travels in Bolivia and Peru toward the end of the 19th century, collected several examples primarily of herders' quipus. These were quipus of local people who were keeping track of camelids or goats or sheep or etc. by means of knotted cords. And here we began to get supplementary information and descriptions about processes of registering information in cords that complemented those data that had been recorded in earlier times in the Spanish chronicles. Max Uhle, the great German archaeologist who worked in Bolivia and Peru and northern Chile toward the end of the 19th, early 20th century, also was extraordinarily important in collecting quipus. Here are images, one a drawing at the top and then a schematic image of one from a village of Cutusuma in Bolivia that Uhle collected. It's an extraordinary quipu itself. He made extensive notes on it. That quipu is now in the University Museum in Pennsylvania, and Sabine Hyland has recently produced an extraordinary study of this quipu and of its manner of recording data, primarily in binary coding. So an extremely important instance here of the very early collection of quipu and recording of data with a recent study. The sort of major figure who really kick-started, one could say, the sort of formal study of quipus in the 20th century was L. Leland Locke. He was a person who, he was from Pennsylvania, but he spent much of his life in Brooklyn, working in the Brooklyn Museum, the Brooklyn Technological College, and he was quite interested in quipus, and he studied quipus in the American Museum of Natural History. He was the first really to pull together a major number of the Spanish chroniclers' accounts of the quipus and to translate them into English, therefore making them available to an English-speaking crowd. And he also then studied about some 50 or 60 quipus and devised a method for recording data in that. His book, The Ancient Khipu, which was published in 1923, is still a major source for people studying the quipus. But one of the things that he accomplished in the study of the quipus was to confirm that, in fact, the knots that appear in different tiers on the quipus do pertain to the recording of numerical data in a base 10 system of numeration. So he studied several samples similar to the schema you see here that has the primary chord running horizontally, a number of smaller chords here as the pendant chords falling, descending here, going down, and then these are bound together by a top chord. And what he found when he worked with the decimal hypothesis, that is that knots are organized in a decimal manner, is that in most such cases, if you sum the values in a group of chords tied together, as here with the value 805, it doesn't work on the screen, and then sum the value of the knots on the top chord that is attached to that group of pendant chords, that you have the same value recorded. So there, this indicated to us that there was a system of sort of checks and balances that was in operation in the recording of the data in many of these quipus. Erland Nordenskjöld was a young Swedish scholar who traveled extensively in Bolivia and in southern Peru as well. He was interested in quipus. He was the major curator at the Gothenburg Museum of World Cultures, and he studied quipus in that collection as well as quipus in the Museum für Völkerkunde or the Ethnologische Museum in Berlin. Nordenskjöld himself was, so he produced very careful drawings and annotated drawings of data recorded in quipus. He himself was convinced that a lot of the data recorded in the quipus pertained to astronomical data, so that he works with the numbers here, suggesting the apparent count of the revolutions of Mercury and Jupiter. Few of his suggestions about the the recording of astronomical data really hold up to the present day. It may be that as we'll come back around in future years to understand a bit better something about the possible link to astronomical data. But it was a major contribution and continued the study of the quipus. For Peruvian contributions to the study, one of the major figures was Carlos Radicati di Permeglio, who was the son of an aristocratic Italian family that moved to Peru in 1926. And Radicati was a collector. He collected rocks and butterflies, but he also and textiles, and he also collected quipus, and was a very careful and dedicated student of the quipus, who published several works in 1960s, 1970s or so, looking at the organization of numerical data in the quipus. Upon his death, I was asked by the University of San Marcos, that had the care of his home, to study his collection. And this was as I found his collection hanging in a wall hallway in his house in 2005, a couple of years after his death or so. And that collection is an extraordinarily important collection that is the core part of a group of quipus currently being assembled for an exhibit of quipus at MALE, the Museum of Art in Lima, which I'll say a little bit more about later. Another person very important in the study of the quipus was Carol Mackey, a student of John Rowe at Berkeley, who wrote, as far as I'm aware, the first PhD dissertation in the U.S. on quipus. It was a quipu, or it was a dissertation that studied both the Inka and modern herder quipus, an extremely important study that really continued to stimulate quipu research in the U.S. and in Peru. She worked closely with Peruvian colleagues to organize what I believe was the first international conference on the quipus that included Carlos Radicati himself in the center. Some will recognize Maria Rostorowski here, the great Peruvian historian. And this is Hugo Pereira Sanchez, who was a student of the quipu as well at a conference. Subsequently, this was the proceedings of the volume were published in an extremely important book in terms of, like quipu students know this is sort of a Bible of early studies of the quipu and Yupana. Yupana is the name of the counting device that was used to calculate information that was recorded in the quipus. So just to be clear, the quipus were not used for calculating. They were not like an abacus. They were where numerical information calculated elsewhere was recorded in a fixed state in the knots, right? So they used these yupanas, which were usually made of wood or stone, that were slotted, and counters would be moved around inside the slots to calculate values then that were recorded on the quipu. So in the drawing of Wamampoma up here, we see a quipu and the Yupana that was that was the device used to correlate it. Most important American studies of quipus in the middle and later years of the 20th century were the work of Marcia and Robert Asher. Marcia Asher was a mathematician. They're both deceased now fairly recently. Marcia was a mathematician at Ithaca College. Robert Asher was an anthropologist at Cornell, and they conducted studies from the mid-1960s to the 1990s, studying quipus, making very careful descriptions of them, and then as a mathematician, Marcia Asher especially made major contributions to the study of the mathematical data. They developed a formula, a kind of format for recording quipu data, here showing the chord number, the types of knots that are recorded, the length of them, the color, the value in a base 10 reading, etc. And over the course of their work, they studied about 230 quipus or so, extremely important study. And then they produced as well analyses, primarily mathematical, but also some analyses that went to the point of how quipus were used in administration. Around the time, toward the end of the 20th century, William J. Conklin, an architect and a great student of Andean textiles and of Andean quipus, produced our first study of the Wari quipus. So these were quipus of a culture that preceded the time of the Inkas by about some 400 to 500 years or so. Bill Conklin had a private collection of quipus, of Inka and Wari quipus. These recently were given to Dumbarton Oaks, and we'll have more to say about these later. Jeffrey Splitsaucer in particular will talk about them. But this brings up the topic then of the development of quipus, the evolution of Inka quipus, and the basic picture here is that there was a type of knotted cord recording device that preceded the Inkas. This was a set of quipus. We have about 40 of these that date to what's called the Middle Horizon Wari period, about 600 to 1,000 years during the Christian era. Jeffrey Splitsaucer has been working on Wari quipus over the past few years or so. He will be the next speaker, and so you will hear wonderful things about the Wari quipu from Jeffrey. We have then a hiatus of about 400 years or so when we don't have known quipus that date to that period, and then we have about 1,050 Inka quipus that date roughly to the period from around 1400, 1450 or so to the time of Spanish conquest. And then quipus continued to be used, to be recorded, to be consulted in the decades and even the centuries following the time of Spanish conquest. And so we will have presentations by Sabine Hyland and Frank Solomon. by Jose Carlos as well later on this afternoon. Just to say something about Hugo Pereira Sanchez, a Peruvian who made major contributions in the study of the quipus of Pachacamac. This is the largest known collection of quipus in Peru, or the site that has the largest number of quipus. There are almost 100 quipus that have provenance of Pachacamac. So this was an extremely important study. In my own study, I began work studying quipus around 2002, and with the help of several grants from the National Science Foundation, began building the quipu database at Harvard. The person who was instrumental in that was Carrie Brazine, who before coming to Harvard she was a mathematics major, and she was a computer specialist and a weaver, and had studied Quechua, and was an extraordinary person to come to Harvard to build the basic applications of the entry of data and the analysis of data in the Inka quipus. This is a table that shows the kind of data that we collected, which was essentially built on the model of the Ashers, but included a lot of construction and structural data that had to do with such things as the way the cords were made, whether they were spun or plied to the right or left, and the type of knots that were produced, etc. So there's a lot of structural information that we began to record that's included in the Harvard quipu database now. After Carrie got her PhD and moved on, then Pavlo Kononenko took over the quipu database and transformed it into a web-based system, and produced extremely important studies, queries of the patterning of color and number of various quipus. After Pavlo then graduated and left, we have to stop letting these people graduate. This is the major problem, right? He left, and then John Clendaniel, who will speak later this morning, has taken over the quipu database. He's also a graduate student in the Harvard Department of Archaeology, one of the few people to ever actually excavate quipus, and he has extraordinary computing and mathematical and statistical knowledge, as you will see later, and has just completed and defended his PhD dissertation on quipu recording. So these are several of the publications that have come from the Harvard Quipu Database Project, beginning here in 2002 with a volume that I co-edited with Jeffrey Quilter, Narrative Threads, looking at the whole question of these narrative quipus. Toward the end of the 20th century, then, we had a major contribution to the study of cord keeping in the Andes. First of all, with the work of Frank Solomon and research that he carried out in the central highland village of Tupicocha, where he found a community composed of 10 ayllus, each with its patrimonial quipu. And Frank's book was an extraordinarily important book. He later went on to work in the village of Rapaz, working on a very large sort of mega quipu that they have in the village of Rapaz. Sabine Hyland, then, who will also speak later, has done extraordinarily important work with colonial and Republican era quipus and quipu boards. She will explain to you later the meaning of those and the relationship between quipus and quipu boards. Other presenters will be Jose Carlos de la Puente Luna, who co-edited an extremely important collection of works on colonial and Republican quipus with his advisor Marco Curatola. Bruce Mannheim, who's been a major figure in the study of Quechua. Quechua was the language of administration in the Inka Empire. We've always thought that Quechua, that the grammar, the structure, the semiology of Quechua ought to have something to do with our understanding of the quipus, and so Bruce will talk to us about some issues having to do with that. And then Terry Daltroy, who is if not the major figure in the study of the Incas, with his first and second edition of his wonderful book on the Incas. He will speak later as well. Then just very briefly, let me just say something about, so I make this argument in the book Inka History and Knots, that that there is a narrative content there encoded in the statistical and quantitative khipu accounts. And so what kind of thing am I talking about creating narratives from that? When we talk generally about narratives and Andean material culture, we're talking mostly about the reading of iconography. So, for instance, one example of this, Moche art, one could say, is the most narrative of pre-Columbian Andean art, in the sense that we often see images that we take to be mimetic depictions of things, events, activities that went on in Moche society, that from the art we can tell stories about, that is, we can create narratives about. Yeah, so that, for instance, the classic example one could say would be what Chris Dunnan worked on as a presentation scene, or the sacrifice scene painted on a Moche vessel, that one can tell a story about the sacrifice of prisoners on the lower level, and then the procession marching with goblets of blood to feed to the great king. So they're recognizable images here, human-like images, in some cases transformed into bird-like creatures, etc. But one can tell a story about this. The question is, can one tell a story about a bundle of strings like this? And I submit that we can do a similar kind of storytelling or narrativizing with quipus, both individual ones and archives of quipus, although these narratives draw from not from the reading of imagery, but from the interpretation of numbers, colors, and structures. So, for instance, in this particular one, I studied this very carefully and produced that schema there, which you will not be able to read either from probably the front or the back of the room. But it's essentially a quipu that records or from Atarco. This is where it was collected, the south coast of Peru near Nazca, and I've interpreted it as a census record of 102 tributaries in a village divided into 6 ayllus organized into moieties, then an upper moiety Hanan and a lower moiety Urton. I could go into the justification of the rationalization of this. Read the book. Don't have time to explain that, but this is the kind of thing. This is an account, like a micro history of the census of a community organized in a particular fashion in a particular place in Tawantinsuyu. And I can, with our hundreds, our 1,000 quipus now, I think systematically over time, if we produce studies of these carefully, we can produce a great collection of micro-histories that we can then begin to piece together into a larger history of the Inka Empire. What kind of histories might be recorded in these Inka quipus? How might we piece them together? When we think about the recording of history, of Inka history to date, it primarily pertains to the Spanish, the histories produced by Spanish chroniclers in the early years following the conquest, the first of which was Pedro Sarmiento de Gamboa's first official history of the Inka Empire, published in 1572, in which he lays out for us the sequence of kings of the Inka Empire. These data, he got the data from quipu keepers, and he organized it in a historical manner, talking about the great kings and queens. Later on, we have the chronicle, for instance, of Garcilaso de la Vega, recounting the stories that he learned from the family of his mother, who was an Inca princess, and it records here the stories of the great Inca nobles and the great battles and the kings and queens, etc. This is like great man history. This is event-based history following the lives and deeds of great men and women, but primarily men of ancient states. This kind of history was confronted, was contested during the middle decades of the 20th century by a school of history called Annales-style, the most noted member of which one could say is Fernand Braudel, who promoted the writing of history that was not based on like the focusing on the works and deeds of great men and women, but rather on the statistical and the numerical realities of demography, of price changes, and the shifts in the physical environment as well. And so with this, he was able to write like works on the Mediterranean, which would be comparable, I've argued, to writing history of the Andes based on the quipus from the statistical data recorded in the quipus. And one contribution of Brodel was to characterize different types, different temporalities in the writing of history, from those moments that move rapidly, those that move more slowly, and then what appears not to move at all. So those are the longue durée. So these are the kind of event-based episodes that I'm arguing here we can talk about in our study of the quipus. The longer multi-year, up to a century or so, kinds of cycles of activities recorded in the quipus. We have sets of those as well. And then we have elements of what one could call the longue durée, or these deep structural principles that are embedded in the organization and in the recording of data in the quipus. The last thing I'll say here, just to finish up so I don't go too much over time, is how history was conceived of by the Inka quipu Kamayak. This is something we know virtually nothing about. And I think we tend to think, for instance, when we do begin to piece together these micro-histories, that we'll piece them together in linear sequences the way the dynasties of the Inca kings were reproduced on the basis of the dynastic sequences of Spanish kings, for instance, on which that was modeled. But I think there are other models we can take here. I draw on the work of Asmaron Legesse to suggest another way of thinking about history. Legesse writes about a very complex system in Ethiopia that was based on a set of 10 age classes moving through age grades over time, so that different people, as they're moving through society, they're also moving through space and time in a set of age grades, so that time and history are conceived of as a close interlinking or integration of the organization of space, time, and history, so that whatever event happened in a particular place in a particular time, it is considered to repeat when the next group occupying that phase in the age grade cycle comes into that position. So I know I'm not explaining this very clearly, but I'm just saying that perhaps we need to think about, when we think about how time might have been conceived of, how history might have been conceived of and written in the Inka Empire, it's not as a linear series, but rather it's perhaps in some more complex structure. Finally, just to say, there have been a few exhibits of quipus. The Museo Chileno de Arte Precolombino in 2003 put on a really extraordinary exhibit. Very recently, in 2018, the Brooklyn Museum, under Nancy Rossoff and her colleagues there, put on an extraordinary quipu exhibit along with the work of the textile artist, Chilean textile artist Cecilia Vicuña. That was extraordinary, and that was done in collaboration with the Boston Museum of Fine Arts, with Dennis Carr and Liz Munzel, and a work producing a similar exhibit. And at present, there is a great project underway for a large quipu exhibit at the Museum of Art in Lima, under the work of Cecilia Pardo, who's here today. But so finally, so these quipus are configurations of colonial colorful, or of colorful knotted strings. And our question today is, what can they tell us about the histories of the lives of Andean peoples? So thank you very much. So I think I went up to my time limit, didn't I? Or do we have a little more time? Do we have maybe 5 minutes? We have 5 minutes. So we have a few minutes. If anyone has any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. Yes?
Can you say something about spelling?
Spelling? Oh, great. That's the question that usually comes up first, and it's the most pertinent one, right? So spelling. So the way you normally see khipu spelled is Q-U-I-P-U. Is that what you're referring to? That kind of spelling, right? It's Q-U-I-P-U, and then I spell it K-H-I-P-U. The Hispanicized spelling is the Q-U-I-P-U. That's the way. That's the kind of spelling for this object that we see early on in the Spanish Chronicles. The way I spell it is based on an orthographic system was developed in the 1970s by Peruvian linguists and like looking at the phonological structure of Quechua and of devising what was considered to be a more logical, direct, and meaningful orthography for spelling. The world is now divided into those people who spell khipu, Q-U-I-P-U, K-H-I-P-U. I was heavily influenced by John Mura, the mentor of Frank Solomon here, and John Mura always spelled it K-H-I-P-U. And sort of politically, one spells it K-H-I-P-U, but practically, one spells it Q-U-I-P-U. It doesn't really matter, but it does make a difference if you're looking at it and you see these two different spellings. Also, it's a difference between Inka, I-N-C-A, and Inka, I-N-K-A. Right. It's just the different orthographic traditions. Right.
Could you speak to the carrying by the khipu makers? One image showed them the khipu slung underneath the left arm. Was that for carrying, for walking? Would it have been gathered up in a bag for protection?
The image that you saw of the person with it carrying like bandolero style tied around his chest, that's from the village of Chupicocha. That's from photographs that Frank Solomon took of the contemporary use and display and manipulation of quipus. None of our older colonial sources that show representations of quipus display show them carrying them or wearing them in that fashion. Perhaps they did. What we know about this, like when we're told something about the transport of quipus, when we're shown something about this, it's suggested that they're wrapped up in a spiral sort of bundle. And so if you see like a quipu primary cord, you have one knotted end, and then you have all the strings that fall, and then there's a long dangle end down here. And you usually wrap the quipu up in a spiral around the knotted end, and then tie it off with its dangle end, so that you can carry it like in just a little bundle. And we think that's the way they would have carried it, probably put in a bag. We found some quipus in bags, so they could be transported in that way.
Thank you.
Has there been any study of the chronological order of the strain being added time one after the other? I mean, I would think that keep one just as is once and then stay like that. They probably calls added every year or something like that.
Quipus were highly editable, so one could correct data by removing a chord and introducing a new chord, for instance. You could also add on data at the end, as you suggest, moving from one year to the next year. We don't really know, in truth, the proper direction of reading a quipu. By tradition, in this description I just gave you, where you have a knotted end on one end and a dangle end on the other, we usually begin by assuming that we begin reading here on the knotted end, and we read left to right. So that's the way we record all the data. But the data in the database is all recorded in such a way you can flip it as well. So if we're wrong about how we should be reading it, we can always reverse it, right? So we can always read it that way. So in those terms, we don't necessarily absolutely know where's the first, which is the first string, which is the last. But we just make this assumption of reading order in that direction, again, with the capacity to change this. So, but as I said also, any editing could be done over time. But it probably was done not so, there may have been some unknotting. There's some controversy over this, unknotting. But most quipu knots that I've studied, the thousands that I've studied, they're extremely tightly tied. and you're just much better off just making another cord and re-knotting it and removing that cord and putting on another cord. So we think that a lot of that went on, but of course there's no record of that.
Have you found evidence of regional systems or dialects? Have you found evidence of regional systems for quipus or dialects? Or are you postulating that there was a single generic Inka language which was throughout the empire?
Fascinating question. I think there probably was, we are told by our chronicles that there was a school in Cusco for the training of high-level Inka administrators. It was a 4-year program, 1 year of studying language, 1 year of studying histories and myths, and 2 years of studying khipu. So there probably was at the highest level, there was a standardization and conventionalization of the production of ways of registering data. But then as you move out from there at the local level, undoubtedly one met many different local traditions of how local people read this or did this, etc. In our khipu database study, we have about 250 of the 1,050 khipus that we have fairly good provenance data on, so we can study those as archival collections. We have 13 archival collections. When you look at when you like produce an icon that is the icon of the sort of most common physical characteristics of the quipus in this archive as opposed to that archive and that archive, we find differences over the territory of Tawantinsuyu. Some regions they prefer 4 chord groups, some 6 chord groups, some have a lot of subsidiaries, some use a lot more color than others. So it's possible that these might be regional ethnic differences sort of work. So there's a sort of tension here between an attempted conventionalization and expressing oneself locally in a local tradition, differentiating yourself from the tradition of another group. Okay, I think we're done there. So let's move on to our next. That's great. So I'm very pleased to introduce the next speaker. This is Jeff Splitsosser, and Jeff is a student of Andean textiles. He has done extraordinary work working with Paracas textiles, wrap stick bundles. He's the major person who has worked on the Waka Prieta, the very ancient textiles from the north coast of Peru. And beginning about 4 or 5 years ago or so, Jeff started looking at and working very closely with the Wari quipus, the tradition that precedes the Inka quipus. And he will talk to us today on the large Wari quipu at Delbar's Notes.